I was an entrepreneur for many years in India, and I will just say this, that it is easier to change human behavior and citizen behavior in India than corporate behavior. I will just leave that out there for you to think about. Uh, I think what the Honorable Prime Minister has done since 2014 is change the landscape of economic activity in India, which is where we used to depend on 4 or 5 or 6 groups, as they were called, earlier that drove the economy. Now we have increasingly a large pie, a large piece of the economy being driven by new entrepreneurs, new people, new young minds, fresh minds, who look at government with a healthy skepticism, and there is a mutual battle on for mutual respect. But the economy is still dominated by the oldies, if I can use that phrase. And that will take some time. I think we have to allow it some time. I don't think this process of sort of delinking from China, especially by some of our corporates who have, sort of heavily invested emotionally or whatever it is in them, is going to be so abrupt. But I have absolutely no doubt in saying today that the roadmap that we have in our mind, especially for electronics, and I say electronics because electronics is the second largest traded global commodity after petroleum. The electronics market worldwide is 1.5 trillion. And out of the 1.5 trillion, $650 billion is China originated. So in a way, the world is addicted to China as a supplier of electronics. And in the post-COVID world, the demand for electronics and digitalization is on the upswing. Because everybody today wants a tablet, everybody wants a phone, everybody, because they're all sitting on the internet and either working or studying or... So the demand for electronics and digital products have increased post-COVID. And this is the irony, that a country that has effectively unleashed the worst humanitarian crisis on the world is the one today that is in a sense benefiting from the rapid digitalization. So that is the equation that we want to change. I think if there is anything, these open societies and countries must dictate the future of technology. And that transition, I suspect, will take a little bit of time. In the interim, I'll put this down to a blip as corporate behaviors change and modify and modulate. I wish you a good morning, and I'm deeply thankful for having been invited to speak here this morning. It's an honor to speak to this distinguished audience, especially at a lecture associated with the late Ekam Jasjit Singh, the Jasjit Singh Memorial Lecture. I take this opportunity to pay tribute to Ekam Jasjit Singh, air warrior, pioneer strategic analyst, whose work most of us read and learned from through the years. I also look forward to these interactions with the men in blue and their families because I have, as Air Marshal Chopra mentioned, spent all of my young life living and learning from the men and families who have served in the Air Force. It has been 100 days since I was given this new opportunity to serve. I have, over the last 15 years, served in another capacity as an MP. And it was only 100 days ago that the Honorable Prime Minister gave me this opportunity to serve in his Council of Ministers. My responsibilities are quite clear and focused. They are both in the areas of technology and electronics broadly, and in skilling and entrepreneurship. So it's a bit out of my pay scale to go suggest to the Honorable Prime Minister about expanding the Air Force or modernizing the armed forces. But it is certainly, I can assure you, it is certainly high on the priority of this government for reasons that I will explain and lay out in my talk over the next 5 to 7 minutes. I consider myself very fortunate to have been given these opportunities to serve and help shape the future in some way for the younger generation of Indians that are inheriting a very different world, a very different global order from what we have been used to or we were used to.
Marshall Chopra mentioned a little bit about my background, and I don't necessarily want to talk too much about where I've come from and where I've gone, but I do want to say this, that I have spent almost all of my adult life involved very deeply in technology. And I can claim to having seen technology move from the 8, 16-bit systems that some of you in this audience may recollect, most of you won't. I know that when I talk about that to my children and their friends, their eyes glaze over and they say, what was that and where was that? And they relate that to the dinosaurs and the world that they see in comics and so on and so forth. But I've seen that world. I have seen it evolve from there to the current multi-core compute and communication world that is transforming and upending the status quo every day. That technology and innovation around technology is changing every known normal and replacing it with a new normal almost every day is the reality. So disruption is the new normal, change is the new normal, whether it is business, education, public services, governance, security, even crime. Every aspect of life as we knew it before the internet, and today's world has technology-inspired avatars of all of those healthily growing and thriving around us. In 2014, our Prime Minister Narendra Modi foresaw the power of technology. And for some of us who were deeply invested in the power of technology, this came as a tremendous opportunity and to contribute. And he unveiled a government-wide approach to technology. This was not technology in some R&D labs. It was not technology restricted to the DRDO or a few universities. This was technology for the country, technology for the people, and he branded it Digital India. And Digital India served one very important purpose, and I will explain to you how we are reaping the benefits of that today. But 6 years ago, it served to accelerate technology growth and adoption and was driven by a very clear, precise formulation of expectation by the Honorable Prime Minister. He wanted technology to transform people's lives. And at a very simple level, that's the statement, but improve democracy, improve governance, reduce the distance between citizen and government. He wanted technology to deliver on that. He wanted technology and innovation to grow our economy, create entrepreneurship, create opportunities, expand the size of the digital economy. And he wanted technology to be focused on so that the country develops strategic technology capabilities and can play a leadership for open societies and democracies to lead the way for the future of technology. And this third point is a very important point, and it is deeply relevant in the conversation of technology as we see it vis-a-vis security. And in all three areas, if you just do a report carding of those three areas, technology has dramatically transformed governance. In the late 80s, famously, a Prime Minister of India said, out of every rupee that was sent from the Delhi for the benefit of a citizen, only 15 paise reached the citizen. And of course, he celebrated that statement because, in a sense, it was, we were accepting that the system was corrupt and leaky. But today we have a model where every rupee that is sent is precisely targeted and hits the account of the beneficiary. So 100 paise that goes from Delhi reaches the beneficiary in the full 100%, in the 100 paise. The second aspect of report carding has technology expanded our economy tremendously so. We are today at about a $200 billion, $225 billion of digital exports from India, which is software, technology services, ITES. And this year alone, in the midst of the pandemic, we have received $65 billion of foreign direct investment into the startup ecosystem. We have created at the rate of 2 unicorns a month in the year 2021. And we are expected to reach 200 unicorns or billion-dollar companies by 2024. So the economy has expanded, opportunities have expanded, and the electronics and the IT space alone will create 8 lakh new jobs this year. We are already, the run rate is already close to 8 lakhs. And so the Prime Minister's expectation of technology expanding the economy and creating opportunities is being delivered on. The third point, as I said, the report carding of that, whether technology capabilities we have built is an area that I believe is work in progress, but we have made, I believe, significant progress in that direction, and we'll talk a little bit about it over the course of the next 5-7 minutes. I just want to again, part of my job is technology evangelism, and so at every opportunity I get, including a distinguished audience like yours, I will keep pushing the case of technology. And if you see the last 18 months of this hellish COVID pandemic that was unleashed from a country that is pretending that it doesn't know what COVID was or COVID is, technology and science has played a big role in India's resilient response. And today, as we speak, we are crossing 1 billion vaccination shots in this country. And we have to salute the admirable resilience and response by our country as a whole, by our countrymen and women, and all those involved, including the leadership, for getting us across these very stormy, choppy waters. A few years ago, our NSA, Ajit Doval, a man whom I respect immensely, said, and I quote, "In the modern world, technology and money are the two things which will influence geopolitics and security. Who will win, he said, will depend upon who has the preponderance over the adversaries of these two facts. And of the two, if you have to make a choice between financial clout and technology is more important." End quote. And so I bring you to the center stage of this conversation, which is that even if we move away from all of the other aspects of economy, opportunity, entrepreneurship, governance, democracy, and technology making a continuing deep impact on those, and we come to the specific issue that concerns you and that you are focused on, which is security, technology is something that we have to focus on tremendously. And India is today, even though I'm no geopolitical expert, I read the papers as much as all of us, but it is clear that India is at an intersection of unprecedented technology capabilities on one hand, post-COVID economic opportunities on the other hand, but also significantly the challenges and unprecedented security challenges emerging from the north and the west. I have said this many times before to audiences less distinguished than you and to audiences more political than you and media as well, that India's economic rise that started in 2014, and just pre-COVID we were at $2.8 trillion. Before COVID hit and slowed us down a little bit, and we had a runway and a visibility and a roadmap to a $5 trillion economy, and this rise is inevitable. The energy of our economy, our entrepreneurs, the governance and policy action all together are creating a perfect storm for this economic rise. But this rise, as I have said before, will not be unchallenged and uncontested and not without hurdles. There are forces and interests that will ensure that this growth of India is as difficult and as mind-ridden as they possibly can. And our national resolve, resilience will be the key, and that will be driven by our technology capabilities. Mr. Rasgotra mentioned about the need for strong security, and even if I take off the hat of being a veteran son, being a proud fan of our armed forces, even if I take that out and look at this purely as an economic issue, a strong security in today's post-COVID world, today's geopolitics, is the only guarantor of our economic rise. And it is the strongest guarantor that if we have to be a $5 trillion economy, We have to make the right investments and the smart investments in ensuring that we have a strong security. There is clearly no way that we are going to be a $5 trillion economy if we are vulnerable security-wise, and that is, and it is precisely those vested interests that I talk about who have the most to lose from our rise that represent our security challenges. There was a time when, let me squarely now come to technology, and I've given you what I believe is my backdrop to this few points that I want to make. There was a time when technology transfer into the defense and security space was about buying platforms. So, and I think we have a long history of buying platforms, getting the know-how to assemble, test, build variants on that. We have seen that in the Air Force, we've seen that in the Navy, we've seen that in the Army. The technology intensity of these platforms have significantly evolved over the last 2 decades. So 2 decades ago, it was fine to get a Su-30 airframe engine and then figure out what you want to integrate into that. It was fine to get an INS Vikramaditya, which is a refurbished floating aircraft carrier, but sans any weapon systems or combat systems, and then take your own time and spend a lot of money in building that. But in today's world, our platforms have to be designed and architected with the mission and outcome that we seek in mind, designed upfront, ab initio. There is no room for retrofitting and screwdrivering the kind of capabilities that we want after having bought a platform. That is my point of view. And I think the Indian Air Force is a great case study to see how technology has evolved and how technology intensity has increased. If you just compare the 71 war and the stories of grit and valor and the Hunter to the Kargil conflict, where we had the same grit and valor but matched with precision weapon systems like the laser-guided ammunition. And then you look at Balakot, where there's a complex interplay and interworking of many technological systems that work together to deliver on the mission and left a significant impact on the enemy. This is the trend, in my opinion, of more and more complex systems interworking to create BVR-type potent capabilities that are designed and architected upfront rather than built as we go along down the road. So what are emerging today is technology that we are referring to, especially in the context of current day threats. There is a proliferation of technologies and challenges that we need to be good at, ranging from networked and highly mobile systems, sensors, artificial intelligence, the internet, encryption, decryption, surveillance. I don't intend to make today's talk about technology, but want to talk about the need for an all of India approach to developing, nurturing, creating mature, capable architectures and platforms. And India has dealt with asymmetric threats for decades, but the growth of the internet and the technologies proliferating on the internet are adding to the complexity of that asymmetry. It's a good time sometimes to pause and think about how did China get to where it has got. I mean, 25, 30 years ago, they were, in my opinion, technologically behind us in many of the key areas today. But they managed in a lot of ways in very questionable ways of getting technology from the West over the 30 years, partly by hoodwinking the West to believing that my enemy's enemy is my friend, and establishing a relationship with the West on technology that the West is today shaking their head and probably regretting. But they built that. They were very focused, they were very clear about building these capabilities in networking, in all of the core technologies. The electronics ecosystem, if you look at China today, is huge, complex. And they have done that with a combination of indigenously developed technologies and what I will call dubiously proliferated technologies. And traditionally here in India, we have worked, the security establishment has worked with the defense labs and at best a few public sector units. And I think in today's world, that has to materially and deeply change, because the capabilities in today's technology and innovation capabilities are from thousands of entrepreneurs across the private sector, within government labs, that have to be all harnessed. I think in the government itself, I can assure you, I'm just telling you, I'm sharing with you, there is a move to move away from ministry-centric R&D. So you have Defense Ministry had R&D, my ministry has R&D, the Department of Telecommunication has R&D, Department of Science and Technology has R&D. So moving away from these ministry-led R&D projects to government-wide, theme-driven, capability-driven R&D projects. So that is already underway, and the Honorable Prime Minister has also approved a National Research Foundation, which will also sort of be the the overarching framework to fund R&D and innovation. The technology to watch out for are going to be one built on the internet and the data of consumers. There's a tremendous amount of technology capabilities being built by our neighbors to the north in AI, machine learning, deep fakes, fake news. There are very real security issues that threaten the nature of the open, safe and trusted internet. It is our government's mandate to keep the internet open, to ensure that the internet is safe and trusted. But there are vested interests that are working exactly counter to that. And a recent study by the Milken Institute in the US showed that fake news spreads 6 times faster online than the truth. And so this velocity of fake news propaganda represents a huge challenge in the information warfare landscape that we have been used to for many, many years. Information warfare a decade ago meant catching hold of a few journals or magazines and having a few stories published, but information warfare now is a total different complexity. Again, like I said, technologies, electronics, warfare systems, encryption, soft radio, trusted semiconductor supply chains, the ability to design our own semiconductors, drones, autonomous systems, ability to see far beyond and sensors. And core to most of these is our ability as a nation to scale up our capabilities and capacities in electronics, design and semiconductor design. That is an area that the Honorable Prime Minister is very, very focused on, encouraging both private sector and government sector excellence in these areas, and encouraging private-public partnerships in this space. Under the leadership of our PM, later in November, India will launch its first semiconductor and systems conference, gathering users, designers, manufacturers, investors all around the table and participate in shaping the future roadmap for our nation in this space. Technological intensity in our toolkit means also need for upskilling and preparing our warriors to combat with the latest technology, maintaining it, engineering it, etc. Skilling, therefore, in today's context is also as important a requirement to win battles. I would strongly recommend, and I have said this in every forum that I am given an opportunity to be a part of, that skilling be an important part of the blueprint in terms of building capabilities. It's not just enough to have a system or develop a system, but also have the capability to optimally use those systems. And so valor and skills and technology, I believe, is the new algebra for winning our asymmetric battles. I will end by saying that the Indian Armed Forces in general, the IAF in particular, have a long history of dealing firmly and successfully with those who challenge India's integrity. The valor of our uniformed men, the support of their families, along with our technological superiority and economic strength, will ensure battlefield dominations today and tomorrow. This is important to understand. If our enemies seek to challenge our rise as a nation, that is the new India, firmly resolved to rise and grow, firmly resolved to defend ourselves when the need arises. I thank you again, and I wish you all the very best in your endeavors, and I remain available to you, as do my teams at the Ministries of Skill Development and Electronics in any way we can serve your mission to touch the sky with glory. Thank you. Jai Hind.
You are in charge of all.
Thank you, sir, for the very insightful lecture.
For India's security. And thank you very
As
much.
we have come to the end of the
Thanks
program.
for the question, Ajit Marshall. Let me quickly tell you on the semiconductor part. For those who say we can't do it, ignore them. The question is not we can't do it, we can do it. It has never been part of our strategic roadmap, if you want to call it that. But post-COVID, it is very clear that there is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and the Honorable Prime Minister saw this coming sometime even before COVID, I believe, for India to emerge as an electronics player. And the reason for that is not because we suddenly woke up and said electronics is important. It is because there is a concept called trust that has now become an important part of global value chains. So trusted value chains, trusted supply chains means automatically that people are wanting to diversify away from the concentration that they have put on China. So, I mean, in our ministry, for example, we have estimated that over $250 to $400 billion of electronics manufacturing will move away from China looking for other destinations. So as part of our national resolve to be competitive, to be a trusted global supplier of electronics, and of course our own semiconductors, strategic autonomy and strategic security, we need to be a part of the semiconductor space. How and what, you will see this very soon being disclosed by the government, but I can assure you we are in that game, we will be players in that game, and we will succeed in that game. So for those who say we should not do it, they should find something else to talk about. On the issue of labs versus manufacturability, I have always, and look, I don't speak for the MOD, and I want to make that very clear, I speak as a technologist, that one of the aberrations in our system has been the distance between the lab and the customer, and the lab and the manufacturer. And actually in today's modern world, there cannot be that distance. The customer and the manufacturer and the designer are actually part of a very tightly integrated ecosystem, and they have to be very close. It's the Russian model of having the lab sit far, far away, the manufacturing be controlled by some aparchik somewhere sitting there, and if the thing drops out of the sky, so be it. I mean, that was, but today's model that works is that R&D, innovation, design are intrinsically linked to the need and the user case or the design win that the consumer and the customer wants. And I think that is now slowly beginning to happen. It's not, I don't think it's done there. There have been some conversations in the government, for example, of creating these R&D design clusters where labs, university and the actual users are all part of a tightly knit ecosystem, and that throws up innovation that is directly much more useful for the customer. So it is a process of evolution, and why we are where we are, it is because where we started with, what model we started with, which is having these labs sit as sort of unaccountable, sort of, let's say,
my submission is we must integrate the user.
Yeah.
That is not happening so easily.
Yeah, and there will be, I think, any process of reform is a little bit of a, and there are entrenched interests and turfs and all of that. But at the end of the day, I think it has to be a user-driven product. It cannot be a scientist-driven product then that is given to the user and say use it. I mean that you can't. I mean it's true for commercial applications, it's true for security applications, it's true for any application. So, Group Captain, I don't disagree with you. I think the direction we are going today, and I said that in my talk, that innovation cannot be limited to emerging from a designated lab. And that does, in today's world, that just doesn't work. It just creates laziness, it creates sloth. That's not how. Innovation is a very competitive space, and the best idea will win from a basket of 100 good ideas of, for example, drone. Now, I particularly believe that this whole space of drone, semi-autonomous systems, autonomous systems, is an area where we have to quickly leapfrog at least one generation and get to where we have to get. And the Honorable Prime Minister is very, very focused on this. He announced a drone policy. But what we will do now, and you will see this roll out in the next 1 or 2 months, is that this is not going to be civil aviation driven, or it is not, it's not that DGCA is going to drive the destiny of drones. We will create every stakeholder, and you will see a drone tech conference that is going to unleash the development of that ecosystem. And capital financing will not limit that, because I believe drone tech has many applications. I and the government believe that drone tech has many applications, including agriculture, including security, including e-commerce, and there are a whole bunch of applications that we don't even know, we haven't even begun to discover. If the objective of the government is to create a healthy, viable, vibrant ecosystem, and then the ideas could come from Hyderabad, it could come from wherever. I mean, it's not necessary that DRDO Bangalore or ISRO Bangalore or XYZ Hyderabad have to be the champions for drones. So the ecosystem, we are very focused on developing an extremely entrepreneurial driven ecosystem, and an ecosystem that allows partnerships between the entrepreneur and the lab and the consumer, and these various applications. When I say consumer, I mean it could be a farmer in Punjab, it could be a farmer in Karnataka, in North Karnataka, who uses that for pesticide spraying. It could be, as people are talking about e-commerce platforms using it for home delivery and so on and so forth. So you will see that play out. It's a very important part of our mission to create Indian capabilities in.
Funds will always be a constraint in our country. So, as you thought on that civil-military fusion, you hinted at that of forming clusters for research. That's one aspect. But there's much more to this. So, it cannot be personality-driven, it has to be system-driven. And as we all come and go, the system should work. And it's only a mix between the civil and the military. If we can get that going, otherwise it is a 5-year cycle that will churn out, and this will change. So there's got to be a system in place.
No, so to that I will only say two things. One is that I think the political leadership of this government is heavily invested in our technology capabilities being a very important part of our rise. So there is a focus on creating capabilities rather than just products or applications. Number one. Number two, as I mentioned in my talk, the approach to design, innovation and R&D, which has been traditionally silos. I want this product, and so let me go ahead and ab initio develop this technology to deliver this outcome or the mission. It is moving to a larger and a broader theme-based design development approach, which automatically implies that there has to be more collaborative R&D. So an IIT Kanpur, for example, I'll give you an example. We have, it is probably not even well known in the country that we have 3 microprocessors that we have indigenously designed in India. IIT Mumbai has designed the Ajit microprocessor, IIT Chennai has designed the Shakti, and CDAC in our ministry has designed the Vega, and they're all full multi-core 64 32-bit microprocessors. But they have been designed by IIT Mumbai without necessarily plugging into the entire R&D ecosystem. So that all of government and all of India approach to design and innovation, the other catalyst for that is going to be the National Research Foundation. If you heard, the Prime Minister already announced that about 10-12 months ago, where money will flow. There will of course be labs and there will always be projects that they do, but there will also be strategic areas. Now, for example, quantum computing, artificial intelligence, blockchain, cyber security. These are not going to be done by one particular lab or one particular agency. This will have to be driven through a collaborative approach where skills exist in Kollam, Kerala, skills exist in Kanpur, skills exist in Kharagpur. And so together, working as a all of India, all of government approach towards these capabilities. Look, I think one of the points that has been made earlier by the Honorable Prime Minister, and I have repeated this as well, is that the future of technology today has to be decided by the democracies of the world. If we don't step up and collaborate as nations, and if within the nation we don't collaborate as institutions,
effectively there is somebody up north who's going to eat our lunch and breakfast and control the trends of the future of technology. And frankly, neither for India, nor for Australia, nor for Japan, nor for the US, nor for Israel, nor for any country that is a democracy and open society do we want the future of technology that are going to sit on the internet being decided by, the standards being decided by, the artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms being decided by anybody other than an open society. I was an entrepreneur for many years in India, and I will just say this, that it is easier to change human behavior and citizen behavior in India than corporate behavior. So I will just leave that out there for you to think about. It is, I think what the Honorable Prime Minister has done since 2014 is change the landscape of economic activity in India, which is where we used to depend on 4 or 5 or 6 groups, as they were called earlier, that drove the economy. Now we have increasingly a large pie, a large piece of the economy being driven by new entrepreneurs, new people, new young minds, fresh minds, who look at government with a healthy skepticism, and there is a mutual battle on for mutual respect. But the economy is still dominated by the oldies, if I can use that phrase. And that will take some time. I think we have to allow it some time. I don't think this process of sort of delinking from China, especially by some of our corporates who have, sort of heavily invested emotionally or whatever it is in them, is going to be so abrupt.